What's going on, guys? It's me, Zach, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. This one, I'm just going to go over each game in week 2 that happened on Sunday. So this won't include the Monday night games, just so that I can record these on Sunday nights and get them to you Monday morning. And I'll just go over a couple quick hitters in terms of things I noticed that game and sort of give you what I think you should to use from those games moving forward. I should be doing these each week, and hopefully it can help you guys sort of really not necessarily overreact each week, but also get a quick rundown from everything that happened this week without having to have to have watched all the games or watched games all Sunday like I did. So with that, I do want to again thank everybody for all the support we've been getting. If this is your first time visiting the channel, please do take a minute to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell so you get notifications when we put out videos. Been doing at least 3 videos every week, but honestly, we've been doing more than that lately. We also update our rankings every single week on realsteelffb.com, so feel free to go over there if you have any start-sit questions. You can refer to my rankings at all times, and if you do want to interact with me more, you are welcome to follow me on Twitter at realsteelffb. But with that, let's get into the first game. The first game we'll go over here is the Patriots at the Steelers. We saw the Patriots beat the Steelers 17-14. It was overall a pretty gross game. I'm sure that any of you that watched it could agree it was a moderately boring game. But a couple takeaways from this game are, first off, I think the only Patriots wide receiver worth really rostering is Jacoby Myers. I talked about Devonta Parker in the preseason as potential late-round sleeper, but he seems extremely uninvolved in the offense, so he's not even really worth taking a look at. And Nelson Aguilar did have a spike week this week. I think he had 6 for 110 and a touchdown, but you're never going to know when it's going to come, so he's not really worth anything more than a really deep league flex dart throw, and even then I'd be more than happy to look elsewhere. But others on the other side of the ball, or this aspect of the offense, the Patriots, I think that both running backs here are going to need a touchdown to pay off for the Patriots. They're struggling to sustain drives, so it's hard for any of these guys to get enough touches to really pay off. Damian Harris had a decent game this week. He had 15 carries for 70 yards and a touchdown, so that'll play, but I really just have a hard time trusting either one of them as anything more than a flex really going forward. Damian Harris did sort of limp off the field at the end of the game last week, so if there's ever a game where one of these guys misses a week, then the other one isn't must start and should probably be a top 15 running back that week, but they're splitting too much for me to trust either one of them as anything more than a flex play. A bit of a downer on the Steelers side of the ball again is Najee Harris, sort of struggling to produce. I want to say he ended up with around 10 fantasy points this week, following up like a 13 fantasy point outing. And the main reason for that is just because Trubisky's not really looking to throw the ball at the running back position. We also saw Jaylen Warren be more involved than he has been in the past. He wasn't involved enough to be anything worth considering rostering, but it's just taken a little bit more away from Najee than what we've seen in the past. It could be due to the injury that Najee sustained last week, but I'm just not comfortable really rating Najee as anything more than an RB2. So if you have Najee, I would probably recommend that you try and sell him. If anybody still wants to give you RB1 value for him, I would trade Najee for Saquon. I would trade Najee for obviously guys like Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon. Just throw it around there, see if you can get a good value out of Najee. I think he's just going to have it's going to be hard for him to have any spiked weeks because the touchdowns aren't going to come with this offense being so bad. He's just not getting the receiving upside to keep his floor high. And then otherwise for the Steelers, I think that really the only wide receiver you can trust is Deontay. He put together another decent outing, but outside of Deontay, there's just not enough to go around in this offense. Pat Freiermuth had a pretty good game, so he's definitely worth rostering and probably starting as a tight end, just given how thin the position is, but I don't trust Claypool or Pickens at all going forward either. In another gross game here, we had the Panthers at the Giants. We did see the Giants get away with a win here, but really there was just not a whole lot of not a lot to love out of this game. The Panthers offense was just an absolute disaster again this week. And really, I think the only two you can trust every week are CMC and DJ Moore. And even DJ Moore is a little shaky. He had like 3 for 43 and a touchdown this week. That'll play because he got the touchdown, but it's just going to be hard to trust that. And Baker really doesn't seem to be looking for CMC in the passing game the way previous quarterbacks have in Carolina. So I'm a little bit worried about CMC even in that regard. CMC, still, to me, is still a top 5 running back in fantasy, but I don't think you're going to have that clear elite upside that you've had in the past. And on the Giants side of the ball, I think the Barkley is really the only Giant worth playing, and he's arguably the only one worth rostering. There's obviously not another running back there. They don't have a tight end that's involved, and their receivers are sort of a receiver by committee. Richie James has been the number 1 receiver so far, and I'm not going to trust Richie James at any point anytime soon. So unless Kadarius Toney can find a way onto the field and start producing, I don't really trust any of these Giants receivers. Next game here is the Jets at the Browns. We saw the Browns with a bit of an all-time choke job here. They could have just had Nick Chubb fall on the ground and ran the clock out, but instead he went into the end zone. The Jets went and scored 2 quick touchdowns with an onside kick in the middle and beat the Browns. So I'm sure Browns fans are pretty upset right now, and they deserve to be, but they sort of deserve to suffer anyway. But I won't get into that. The Jets here, the running backs are just pretty much a clear split. It's going to be really hard for me to trust either of these guys as anything more than a flex because you're going to need a touchdown or a spiked reception week out of these two. And it seems to me that Michael Carter is the more involved running back as a receiver, but you did see Breece Hall get in the end zone on the reception this week. It's just going to be hard to trust either of them, and I think that you got to keep them both as a flex play. But obviously, I'd rather own Breece Hall going forward just because I think he's going to eventually take over that backfield. The Jets wide receivers were a little bit more clear this week. We did see Garrett Wilson sort of have his coming out party in the NFL. He had 101 yards, 8 receptions, and 2 touchdowns, along with the game winner. So Garrett Wilson was really good this week. He's definitely somebody I want to roster. If he is for whatever reason unrostered in your league, I think he's owned in about 70% of ESPN leagues when I checked. So if he's on waivers, he's definitely a high priority ad. But if not, just maybe take a look and see if you can get him. He's a guy I would be moderately interested in going forward. I think he's probably going to be the Jets wide receiver 1 this season. Amari Cooper had a pretty good week for the Browns. I think he had like 9 for 101 and 1. So he's going to be a flex-worthy asset going forward, but I still don't love it. Jacoby Brissett's just not great, and the Browns are not going to get to play a defense as bad as the Jets as often as they did this week. So I don't necessarily trust any of these Browns pass catchers. And for the Browns, both running backs are weekly starts. They both had pretty decent weeks this week. Chubb, obviously, with the monster game with 3 touchdowns. It's pretty safe to say that between the two of them, you're going to get 200 total yards and 2 touchdowns every single week. You're not really going to know how that's going to get split up, but they're both worth starting every single week. In a bit of a shocker, we saw the Colts lose 24-0 to the Jaguars. For whatever reason, the Colts have been just extremely unable to win in Jacksonville for like the last 7 years. So I'm not necessarily going to read too much into this because something about divisional games does end up making things a little bit different. But it's hard to deny that the Colts did look absolutely awful. It's pretty clear here that the Colts don't have a true number 2 receiving option. Ashton Doolin did step up and ended up leading this team in receiving, but none of them looked capable of stepping up and filling the void left by Pittman not starting this week. So I don't really trust any Colts receivers, but Pittman and Doolin is maybe a very deep league stash, but not a guy you can trust. Jonathan Taylor was really held in check. He had 9 carries for 54 yards. I think he had 1 or 2 receptions as well, but obviously that's not going to cut it with Jonathan Taylor. I'm not worried about Taylor because I think that the Colts are in for better days. If you remember last year, they started really slow and they turned it around okay. And I think I'm willing to bet on that again this year, but they do need to do that. And if they do continue to struggle this whole year, it is going to be hard for Taylor to dominate just because it's hard for teams to run the ball as much as the Colts would like to if they're trailing in games. So that could mean that you see a little bit more of Naheem Hines, but they just need to be better on offense. I think Matt Ryan's going to be better. They're going to get Shaquille Leonard back next week probably. So the Colts in general should be better. They do have a tough matchup against the Chiefs next week, so it could be another game where the Colts struggle, but I'm not worried about Jonathan Taylor at all, and if whatever owner in your league has him is, then I would certainly be looking to trade for Taylor. For the Jaguars, James Robinson was the clear lead back again. He had 23 carries to Etienne's 8 or 9, so I think you can start James Robinson every week going forward. The Jaguars aren't going to have a lead like this every single week. I think that's pretty safe to say, but it's clear that they want to use James Robinson as much as possible, and James Robinson looked good. He wasn't actually that efficient, but watching him play, he looked good, and he did have that 1 long run, so he's got enough burst to house things. Etienne, on top of that, is probably just a low-end flex play at this point in time. He's just not getting enough touches for me to love it. You're going to need the Jaguars to get down early for him to have any spike weeks, and I don't love that. And outside of those two, Christian Kirk is the clear number 1 wide receiver for Jacksonville. He's going to be a must-start going forward. I probably will have him ranked as a top 20 wide receiver pretty much every single week going forward. He's a guy that you got to start every week. Another guy I don't have listed here, but Evan Ingram did come up with 7 catches. Given how thin the tight end position is, he might be worth taking a look at in deeper leagues, or if you're streaming a position, he's a guy worth looking at. It was pretty easily the game of the week here. We had the Dolphins top the Ravens 42-38. The Dolphins offense just absolutely exploded in this one. They found themselves down, I want to say 21, some point in the middle of the third quarter, and they just absolutely erupted from that point forward. You had both Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle combined for almost 400 yards through the air on their own, about 200 each, so both those guys are monsters. They're obviously not going to do that every week, but they're good enough that you're obviously going to start them every single week, and they might actually elevate Tua into being a fringe top 12 quarterback going forward. I'm not ready to say he's going to be a weekly must start, but he's certainly a quality streaming option. The biggest takeaway for me really out of this game, because really nobody that we have been banking on underperformed other than Chase Edmonds here. Edmonds was pretty clearly the second running back option in the Miami offense to Raheem Mostert. And that was really shocking to me, given how much usage Edmonds had in week 1. I'm not sure necessarily what the reasoning for that was, and obviously it worked out for the Dolphins because they did win the game. But Edmonds had at one point like 3 carries for 3 yards and 1 reception when Mostert had like 10 carries and 2 receptions. So that's certainly troubling. Edmonds sort of made his day look a little bit more respectable at the end with a 30-yard run on that last drive, but I don't I don't trust Edmonds really going forward, which really hurts me because I have him in a lot of leagues where I really drafted him to be a guy I can start every single week, and I'm just gonna have a hard time doing that going forward. I also think that on top of that, you're not really gonna be worth it's not gonna be worth rostering any Ravens running back other than Dobbins. We saw again the Ravens just had to throw the ball as much as possible and give a few running backs a few carries, but nobody got all of it, and you just can't play a Ravens running back other than Dobbins, and even then you got to wait and see with Dobbins because they might just be super pass heavy. And again, even as much as this Ravens offense exploded, I think that Bateman and Andrews are still really the only Ravens pass catchers worth starting. Duvernay did have a big kickoff return touchdown here, and he had like 2 catches for 42 yards. He did leave the game with concussion, but Duvernay is certainly someone worth rostering, but he's not a guy I'm going to trust in my starting lineup. And it's just going to be hard to trust the number 2 wide receiver in this offense, so I'm probably staying away there. Next game here is the Buccaneers at the Saints. We should see the Buccaneers beat the Saints 20-10 in this one. There's not a whole lot to take away from this one for me. We saw Fournette be a bell cow again. He's going to be a weekly must start, even in tough matchups and even coming off what seemed to be a bit of an injury this week. Olave and Michael Thomas performed very well again, and I think they're both going to be must starts going forward, especially Olave, and what a role that I expect to see increase throughout the season. MT is going to be a weekly must start as well, though I don't think all of them ranked really close to each other throughout the course of the season. Juwan Johnson for the Saints is worth a look in deeper leagues as a tight end. He had 4 catches for 40 yards. And, I mean, this is a Saints team that really might have to throw a little bit more than I expected coming into the year. And with how thin the tight end position is, I think Juwan Johnson is worth a look. And on top of that, there wasn't a whole lot. I think Russell Gage is droppable here. You saw him play in a game without Godwin or Julio and really not managed to do much there. So Gage is a guy you can drop. And we also saw that in a game where the Saints are missing Alvin Kamara, there's not a true backup. We saw Mark Ingram and Tony Jones Jr. get plenty of run, and I just think it's hard to trust any backup running back in any week that Kamara misses, so any running backs in the Saints roster not named Alvin Kamara are droppable as well. Next game here, which was super fun, is the Commanders at the Lions. We saw Amon-Ra St. Brown absolutely explode again for, I want to say, 116, and 2 touchdowns, and he added about 70 rushing yards on the ground as well, so Amon-Ra St. Brown's an elite NFL player. I think that's clear at this point, and I have him ranked probably as a top 10 receiver the rest of the season. He's on a team that's going to have to score quite a bit because their defense isn't great. He's more than capable. He's just a really good player. So Amon-Ra's awesome. If for whatever reason you can still buy him and just buy into the fact that he's got mediocre draft capital and people don't like Lions, I would still try to trade for him. He's a guy I'm happy to buy high on. Swift, again, was hyper efficient. He did have limited touches this week just because he came into the game a bit banged up. So monitor his injury status going forward. Jamal Williams did get quite a few touches and would be a guy worth flexing if there were any rumors, again, of Swift being added limited or missing time. For the Washington Commanders, I think that all 3 of their receivers, Samuel, McLaurin, and Dotson, are startable going forward. Samuel, again, was super involved. They manufactured touches for him, and he was really good when he got them. So Sanders is a guy you can start every week. Dotson's going to be probably a little bit touchdown dependent, but he's clearly a guy they're using in the red zone, and McLaurin, he's elite. You got to use him every single week. Logan Thomas is a guy worth looking at tight end just because, again, we've seen him perform at this level before, and tight end position is so thin, he's definitely worth looking at. The running backs for the Commanders, we did see Antonio Gibson struggle on the ground. He had 14 for 28, and he salvaged that with a rushing touchdown. So he's a guy that you can play going forward until Brian Robinson comes back, but I'm not in love with Antonio Gibson. He certainly could struggle a little bit more, and then when Brian Robinson comes back, I expect it to be a bit of a timeshare there. And J.D. McKissick, we saw him be extremely involved through the air. He's a guy that's going to be usable in the flex in games where you expect the Commanders to be losing, but he's not a guy I really trust weekly, and he's definitely a fringe waiver wire worthy asset, so he doesn't have to be rostered if you don't want to. The next game here is the Seahawks at the 49ers. The most notable thing in this game was the Trey Lance injury. We saw him suffer a severe ankle injury that's going to cause him to miss this entire season, and I think it's safe to say that it is obviously very tragic for Trey Lance, and I wish him the best going forward, but this does probably raise the ceiling of all of the other skill players for the 49ers. This is going to be a far more pass-heavy offense going forward. They're still going to run the ball a ton, but they're going to throw the ball quite a bit more. You're not going to have as much goal line usage from the quarterback, so there's going to be a lot more touchdown opportunities for everybody on this team. I think that, in general, you're not going to ever start Jimmy Garoppolo, but it does help everyone else in the Niners offense. it was clear in this one that Jeff Wilson is their clear lead back, and Jeff Wilson looked good too. So the Jeff Wilson's definitely gonna be a guy that you can start going forward. Tyrion Davis-Price was the clear backup for them. It was not Jordan Mason. So Jordan Mason's going to be droppable after this week. Feel free to get rid of him. If an injury does happen to Jeff Wilson, you can trust TDP in your lineup as well, but there's no one else really worth looking there. For the Seahawks they sucked this week. I think that really we're going to see a lot more of that throughout the course of the season. They're just not a very good team. They're mixing in different running backs. You're not going to be able to trust any of these running backs. I think that honestly, if you have Penny, if you have Walker, I'd try to trade him for anything you can because you're never going to know when you can start them. Even in a good matchup against the Falcons next week, I would argue that the Falcons are a much better team than the Seahawks. So I can't see myself ever starting a Seahawks running back this season. And for the receivers for the Seahawks, we did see Tyler Lockett have a 9-reception game for 100 yards. It was super quiet. I don't even know how he did that, but I just don't trust myself starting any one of these Seahawks receivers as well. You can because they're super talented, but again, I would probably try and trade Lockett after this week. I don't think he's going to be able to do that very consistently. And honestly, if I have Metcalf, I'm probably at least looking around to see if I can get out of that as well. I'm out on the Seahawks offense as much as possible. Next game we saw here was the Falcons at the Rams. The most notable thing for me was just how impressive Drake London looked. I think he finished with 8 receptions for about 80 yards and a touchdown, and he's a guy I'd be willing to buy high on. He was the first receiver taken in this draft. He was drafted to be great. He's clearly the number one target in this offense. I'm surprised that it's not Kyle Pitts, but it is Drake London. They're using him. He got his first touchdown today, and he's a big body. He's going to continue to catch touchdowns throughout his career. He's a guy I think you could play as a wide receiver 3 the rest of the season. So if you can get him, I have no problem trading wide receiver 3 value for him. He's going to be really good the rest of the year, especially given that the Falcons I'd expect them to be losing for most of these games and playing from behind, and you're going to get a lot of opportunity for them to do what they did today, which is play catch up. Kyle Pitts busted again. I think he only had 2 catches, and I'm still in on the talent. I think he's just too talented for them to continue to not use him. They're really letting him be involved as a run blocker for whatever reason. He's their second most talented receiver on this team. He's a guy they have to be involved with, and you can play him at the tight end position, so he's still extremely valuable. If you don't have an elite tight end, I'm certainly looking to buy low on Kyle Pitts going forward. Another thing that shocked me here was that Cam Akers actually looked pretty decent. He was still less efficient than Darrell Henderson, but I think this is going to be a pretty clear split where both these guys are maybe flex-worthy. None of them really stand out to me as elite, but I think that if either one of them does have an opportunity to step forward and take the full control of that starting lineup, it is still probably Cam Akers. He's a guy I'm not necessarily looking to buy low on, but just keep an eye on him. I think he's going to be a little bit more involved than he was in week 1. A lot of people wrote him off, so if he's a guy that you are in on, this could be a good week to buy on him, just because I think that he did sort of get himself out of the doghouse with McVay this week, and Darrell Henderson hasn't done anything to stranglehold that starting role, so Akers looked okay, and I wouldn't mind rostering him. Kupp obviously dominated again. He's a must start every week. Allen Robinson was involved early. He got his first touchdown in this opening drive, but when the game sort of became less scripted, they really did stop using him. Stafford still clearly doesn't really look for Allen Robinson down the field. And I don't know. I think that if you have Allen Robinson, I'm someone who is super high on him. I have him in a couple leagues. And I think I'm going to be looking to trade him this week. He finished with a relatively respectable outing. He had 4 for 53 and a touchdown. So that's certainly usable, but he had 2 for 16 and a touchdown on the first drive. And the rest of the game, he had 2 for 37. And I just can't see myself trusting that. I don't want to bank on a touchdown out of my wide receivers for them to perform. And he's just not a guy that Stafford is looking for right now. It's possible that he gets used more down the field and Stafford and him develop more chemistry throughout the course of the season. So I don't mind holding Allen Robinson. I'm not going to sell low on him. But if you have a league manager in your league that really loves Allen Robinson and thinks that this week means he's back on track and everything's going to be fine, I would absolutely not mind trading him. Another way you could approach it is that the Rams do play the Cardinals this next week. That game should be a shootout, so if you do want to hold Allen Robinson for one more week, let Allen Robinson probably put up another touchdown. I'd expect a 5 for 80 and a touchdown performance out of Allen Robinson next week, and then sell him after that. I think that's another good way to play this, but I just have a hard time seeing Allen Robinson really dominating the way I expected him to. We're going to see Van Jefferson back at some point, who's somebody that Stafford has chemistry with. He's going to take away a lot of the deep targets, and I don't know. Allen Robinson looks good. I think he's still a really good player, but if Stafford's not looking for him, I don't want to hold on to that bag. Another last guy I want to talk about here is Tyler Higbee. He was highly targeted again. He had 7 receptions for 70 yards. Like I've said before, as thin as the tight end position is, he's definitely worth taking a look at. Next game here was the Cardinals at the Raiders. We saw the Cardinals really start off this game looking just as bad as they did in the first week, but then they really rallied and they actually ended up winning this game. They won in overtime on a scoop and score fumble recovery from Hunter Renfrow. A couple takeaways from this game. Connor did leave the game with an injury, and it did seem like we really saw that the Cardinals showed that Darrell Williams is pretty much their clear backup. Benjamin was still used and involved, but Benjamin is clearly going to be the more pass catching role kind of player. They're sort of using him like Chase Edmonds was used back last year when they had Edmonds. So if Connor were to miss time, I think Darrell Williams is the one you'd want to add off waivers. Zach Ertz was far more involved this week. Marquise Brown underwhelmed again. I'm starting to get pretty concerned about Marquise Brown. He really hasn't taken advantage of the opportunity to be the number one receiver in this offense, and he's only going to lose targets and opportunity when DeAndre Hopkins comes to town. So I would probably wait for him to have a good week here in the next 4 weeks. Wait for him to have one of those signature blow-up games. It could be next week against the Rams. And I'd probably try and sell high after that. I just don't see him really being a usable high-end wide receiver 2 the rest of the season. And I think a lot of people still see that in him. He had a garbage time touchdown in week 1. He had a game going to overtime, so he got extra snaps and opportunity to perform this week. And he's just not doing it for me. He hasn't done anything spectacular. He hasn't looked great. And I don't think he's a true number 1 wide receiver in the NFL. And I think he's just going to be a guy that you can't necessarily trust every single week. So I'd be looking to sell high on him. Greg Dortch might be worth a look in deeper leagues. He did, again, have a pretty good week. I think he had 4 for 53 and a touchdown, so he's worth adding if you're in a deep league. It was again clear that Josh Jacobs is the lead back, but he had 19 carries and only 1 reception. So I think that really Josh Jacobs is going to be a touchdown-dependent low-end running back too, and if Samir White finds his way onto the field anymore, Jacobs is a sell. So similar to Marquise Brown, I'd probably wait for Josh Jacobs to have a couple touchdown games and move on from him. If you want to start shopping Josh Jacobs right now, see what you can get for him, I would not be against doing that. And surprisingly, Devontae Adams was held to 2 receptions in this one. We saw Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow be the far more involved wide receivers here. I think this offense just isn't good enough to support 3 wide receivers, so it's going to be hard to really predict which 2 of the 3 are going to have good weeks. There might be weeks where they all 3 just sort of underwhelm a little bit, but Devontae Adams is still clearly the number 1 here. You've got to start Devontae Adams every week, but again, similar to other players I've mentioned in this game, if Devontae Adams has a blow-up game, I wouldn't mind trying to flip him. Next game here is the Texans at the Broncos. Most notably here, the Broncos really just struggled to move the ball. We saw at one point Russell was like 6 for 20 for 50 yards and an interception. It was really bad, but I think I'm still not worried at all about the Broncos. They're going to get it together. We saw Jerry Jeudy leave this game early with an injury, so the only healthy receiver for the Broncos was Courtland Sutton. They're already missing Tim Patrick, and KJ Hamler missed this game as well. So they were playing with Courtland Sutton and a bunch of practice squad receivers. So it's not shocking the Texans were able to hold them in check a little bit. The Broncos were still able to run the ball very effectively. They just sort of chose not to, which was a little puzzling. Sutton was, again, an absolute target hog. He had 7 for 122, and he drew a couple of deep PIs as well. So Sutton's going to be a weekly must-start, and I think Russ is also going to be a bit of a buy low for me this week. I think that he's had 2 pretty underwhelming games, but there's nothing. I haven't seen him perform poorly. The interception he threw was sort of on Sutton. It was just in a tight window. It bounced out of Sutton's hands. And he's Russell Wilson. He's a future Hall of Fame quarterback. He's going to be totally fine. The running back split did lean towards Devontae again. He wasn't as involved through the air as he was last week. That was to be expected, but only 1 reception is a little underwhelming for him. On the Texans side of the ball, we did see Dameon Pierce dominate the Texans' backfield in terms of carries, but he didn't find the end zone. He only had 1 reception. So I think really the whole Texans' backfield is going to be one I want to avoid until I see any improvement out of either him or Burkhead. For the receivers, Nico Collins did lead the team in receiving yards. He had 4 for 58. I don't think Nico Collins is a guy that you can start weekly. Brandon Cooks, again, had like 5 for 43, or maybe it was 4 for 53, but either way, Brandon Cooks is really the only player on the Texans that I think you can start going forward. Nico Collins is worth looking at in deeper leagues, but otherwise, there's not much to take away from this game. Next game here is the Bengals at the Cowboys. We shockingly saw the Bengals fall to 0-2. They've now lost to Mitchell Trubisky and Cooper Rush to start the year, so that's certainly disappointing for them, hoping to rebound from the Super Bowl loss. Higgins was active in this one, and he was very productive. He finished the game with 6 for 73 and a touchdown. Maybe it was 71. Regardless, Higgins is going to be a weekly must-start along with Jamar Chase. We saw Mixon get all the snaps again, so he's again weekly must-start. Probably going to be a top 7 running back at the end of the season. A couple surprises on the Cowboys side of the ball. We saw Noah Brown flash. He had 5 for 91 and a touchdown. I've liked Noah Brown a little bit, just even a year ago and early on the season as a late round dart throw waiver wire ad. So Noah Brown's a guy I think he's worth taking a look at. He's definitely got chemistry with Cooper Rush, but with Michael Gallup coming back, I don't know that you can really trust Noah Brown for any more than maybe next week if Gallup misses again. But so he's not a priority ad, but he's a nice story, and I think he's got potential value as a flex if you need him in a deep league. We did see Pollard be more involved. He clearly, again, looked like the better running back to Ezekiel Elliott. It feels like we've been saying that for years, but he's just a more explosive player. He's a guy I think you can play as a low-end flex play with upside. And again, if anything were to ever happen to Ezekiel Elliott, he's going to be a monster. A little bit more disappointingly, we did see Dalton Schultz disappoint, and he got a little bit banged up at the end of the game. I think I'd like to bench Dalton Schultz going forward until I see Dak Prescott come back. Dalton Schultz is a talented player, but he's not talented enough to make up for just not being involved in the offense, and Dalton Schultz clearly is just not as much of a target for Cooper Rush as he is for Dak, so I'd look to move on there. Last game we'll go over here is the Bears at the Packers. The Bears really just can't move the ball through the air. They've had a couple of big plays so far this season, but that's about it. Fields has 15 total completions through 2 games and only 2 total receptions for Darnell Mooney and Cole Kmet combined, which is just shocking. There were guys that I was actually pretty high on this offseason and really expected to be usable this year. I still think both those two will be. There's certainly buy lows for me. I don't know if you even have to buy low on Cole Kmet. I think you might see him hit waiver wires, and Mooney himself might even hit the waiver wires here pretty soon. But Mooney is absolutely a guy I'd be looking to buy low on. I don't think you're going to have to trade a whole lot for him, and he's certainly got upside. We saw what he can do last year. They're not going to be in games every single week against opponents that just look to run the clock out like the Packers were. They're going to have more than 7.5 completions a game. Mooney and Kmet are still going to be the clear number 1 and number 2 targets in this offense, so I'm definitely buying low on them just because they've got so much upside and they're not going to cost you anything. Montgomery looked really great, which is weird because he sort of didn't last week, but Montgomery's going to be a low-end running back too for as long as he's got that starting running back role there. Aaron Jones did what he does. He was dominant. He was hyper-efficient. He had about 10 yards per touch this week, and A.J. Dillon sort of took a back seat. I think Aaron Jones is obviously going to be a must-start, along with A.J. Dillon. They're both just too involved in this offense to really sit them. And again, there just really wasn't a standout wide receiver for the Packers. We saw Allen Lazard catch the touchdown, but he only had 2 receptions. We saw Sammy Watkins have the big catch at the end of the game, but he only had 3 for 93, and that's not going to be very sustainable. And they used Christian Watson on some end arounds and some touch passes, and Randall Cobb on some third downs. But it's just a wide receiver by committee there, and I don't think you can trust any wide receivers out of the Green Bay Packers until we see more from them. So thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.